Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second panel discussion of the Between Gestures Festival. This one is titled Archives in Motion and will be moderated by Franz Anton Kramer. Franz Anton has been working in dance archives since 2003. He conducted the research project Records and Representations, Media and Constitutive Systems in Archiving Performance-Based Art at the Inter-University Center for Dance in Berlin, where he also co-directed the BA course Contemporary Dance, Context, Choreography from 2007 to 2010 with Gisela Müller and Boris Scharmatz. Between 2003 and 2008, he collaborated with the Leipzig Dance Archives, the Centre National de la Danse, and the Library of the Paris Opera Museum in a project investigating dance in the 1930s and 40s. He has also been part of an initiative to federate several German dance documentation centers between 2008 and 2012 as part of Tanzplan Deutschland. Together with Barbara Bouchard, he is co-editor of the special interest magazine Map Media Archive Performance. So he's the perfect person to moderate this discussion. And something else I read also says that you are a dance scientist. I have never heard this term before. I would like to ask a question about it when we get to that portion. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Well, dance scientist, I don't know, that's maybe...
It's the translation for dance scholar. It's the translation for dance scholar. It's a mistranslation for dance scholar.
Right, exactly. So, welcome also from my side. Thank you for being here. Thank you for organizing this meeting, and thank you for having us in the Columbia College. Just a brief overview on the topic you already mentioned. It's called, the panel is, or the conversation is about archives in motion. A bit, let's say, inspired when we set up or planned this together with Susan Manning. We wanted to come back to a topic that's being much discussed throughout, and Kang Sen, Singaporean curator, termed archival turn. So an interest, a growing interest, a widespread interest in historic issues on the one hand, historic issues both on the micro level, let's say individual works, individual dance histories, dance biographies, but also, of course, on the macro level. How did dance come to be what it is today, and how is it documented, and with what strategies and in what ways? So some of the questions that will be ours tonight are, for instance, what can things past teach us in dance and performance, as dance and performance usually are considered to be very rooted in the moment, in the very moment of their happening, of their actuality. So what happens when we transform this or transfer this or translate this in other forms of being? What are the strategies that we can adopt or that we should adopt, and also that artists adopt in their work? We have seen one example last night already by the Ex Homo by Paul P. And then, of course, what do we behold as an audience? What can we make of historic artifacts that are issued on stage? Many questions, excellent panelists. I'm very proud to present to you the four panelists that come together tonight, distinguished experts in their field. Maybe I can briefly just introduce. Something happened? Okay, sorry. Starting with Susan Manning, internationally recognized historian of modern dance, whose writings have been translated in German, French, Italian, Spanish, and Polish. She's the author of Ecstasy and the Demon, the Dances of Mary Wiegmann, and also of the monograph Modern Dance, Negro Dance, Race in Motion. She has been curator for an exhibition held at the National Dance Center in Paris, Danse Noire, Blanche Amérique, so Black Dancers, White America. And she's also active as a dramaturge for Reggie Wilson's, or has been active as a dramaturg for Reggie Wilson's Moses. Is this how you pronounce it? Okay. And has been a co-editor of several edited volumes, especially to mention New German Dance Studies. I had the honor to be part of it. Thank you again, 10 years later. And Futures of Dance Studies. And currently she is the Herman and Beulah Pierce Miller Research Professor of English Theater and Performance Studies at Northwestern University. And as you can see, Susan prepared a PowerPoint presentation, let's say summarizing a bit her experiences, her viewing experiences, and her research results. Some of it inspired, I think, from your participation last September in Berlin in the ambitious Dance Heritage Program, What the Body Does Remember, at the Academy of Arts in Berlin. So I'd like to hand over to you.
Yeah, I somewhat over-prepared, but I'll try to be quick with my little PowerPoint. If you guys want to not be in the light, that's probably
Right,
fine.
we should,
and then you'll introduce all the other panelists as they speak. So again, with apologies for a bit of over-preparation here, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of how I see the archival turn, and a term that I use to describe works that are based to some extent on dance history, but certainly are not trying to create a facsimile of the original performance or of the source text, which I would call a reconstruction. And of course, it's not a clear binary, and those things obviously blur into one another. So just reflecting on performances I've seen over the last 30 years, I identified 5 impulses that are kind of motivating these works. And again, this is very, of course, this is not the sum total of what each of these works are. Of course, these impulses, many of these works have more than one of these impulses, but it just seemed a good way to organize what just something of what I've seen over the last 30 years. So let me start with the first impulse, paying homage to an earlier artist. And there's kind of 3 examples for each of my 5. This is a little bit of a typology. Of course, paying homage to earlier artists, this has been done forever in the arts. It's not something that's linked to the so-called archival turn. But the first example there is Susana Linka's Efectos Humanos, recalling Dor Hoyer's work. Of course, we've already seen Paul P.'s truly brilliant reperformance, reenactment of this work. But Susana Linka had seen Dor Hoyer as a teenager, a powerful experience which led her to a dance career, and so she wanted to recreate the work, substituting her own choreography for one section, dropping one of Linka's sections. We'll start there. Another work paying homage to an earlier artist is Jawale Zolar's Walking with Pearl, 2-evening work, the Southern Diaries and the African Diaries. And of course, I want to keep saying, oh, and I got to see that here at the Dance Center, so thank you, the Dance Center. I'm not going to put all those little things in of where I got to see everything. But Pearl Primus, an artist from mid-century, and so what Jawale did in Walking with Pearl is reconstruct passages from her choreography, read portions of her diaries, offered her own reflections, and herself says, I think Pearl Primus was an original urban bushwoman, an artist who was engaged with social commentary and social protest in a movement vocabulary, which is a very Africanist-infused modern dance vocabulary. So that's My third example of paying homage, Bill T. Jones' story time from 2012, which used John Cage's Indeterminacy. That was a score where Cage wrote 1-minute stories, but some of the 1-minute stories had 5 words and some had 50 words. Merce Cunningham had used this in his 65 work, How to Pass, Fall, Kick, and Run. So what Bill T. Jones did is use the Cage stories, write some of his own stories, and he was in the center of the stage reading as his dancers were all around, published a book that documents that process, including his speaking scores. And I think what's also fascinating here with Bill T. Jones is how, acknowledging the legacy of both John Cage and Merce Cunningham, he also very subtly challenges the whiteness of postmodern dance in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s, decades when black choreographers like Pearl Primus were engaged in activism on behalf of civil rights and the black arts movement. And this is a transition to what I see as the second impulse across the archival turn of the last 30 years, and that is critiquing and reversing the exclusions of modernism, in particular exposing the whiteness of the earlier avant-garde. Trajal Harrell, who will also see this weekend his early work, or his early work, the work that really brought him to all of our attention, 20 Looks, or Paris is Burning at Judson Church, which came in 7 versions or 7 sizes, from extra small to extra large. Really underscores the whiteness of that Judson Church movement that launched the careers of Yvonne Rainer, Trisha Brown, Lucinda Child, so many other artists. And it's really a thought experiment. He says, what if the dancers from the Harlem Ball scene, the Vogue scene, which was very underground in those years of the early 60s, what if they encountered the dancers at Judson Church? So his movement of vocabulary sort of parallels that thought experiment, bringing together voguing, kind of cabaret and dance theater. And then Faustin Lindekula does something similar in his work when he frames Millicent Hodson's and Kenneth Archer's quite strict reconstruction of La Création du Monde, which is originally premiered by the Ballet Suédois in 1923, with costumes by Ferdinand Léger. You see one of his drawings on the left, choreography by Jean Bourlain, and a musical score by Darius Milhaud. And so here's the reconstruction by Millicent Hodson and Kenneth Archer, and then it was framed by Faustin's own choreography, and it just makes us really see the primitivism of that earlier work. And I have to say, it's one thing to intellectually recognize how European primitivism of the 20s was a fantasy of an Asian other. It's something else to really viscerally experience Faustin, who's an artist based in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, how he reveals how those primitive fantasies obscure the realities of colonial violence. Another work that exposes the exclusions of modernism is this work by Piché Klunshin, who's a Thai artist trained in classical mask dance known as Kon, who works between classical and contemporary traditions. And he also looks back at early 20th century choreography of the other in Paris. So fascinating work, Nijinsky Siam, based on the 1910 work Danse Siamoise from the Diaghilev suite La Danse Orientale, choreography by Fokine, designs by Leon Basque, and then performed by Nijinsky. You see Nijinsky on the left. You see only one image from Nijinsky Siam on the right. Fascinatingly, we know that Fokine did see a troupe of dancers from what was then called Siam, now called Thailand, on tour in Russia in 1900. And Klunshin, as a traditionally trained dancer himself, really saw that Nijinsky had taken moves from traditional dance, though this is upside down, as he explains. This was, this was a gesture that would have been found but turned upside down. So he asks, is Fokine's dance simply Orientalist, or is it the result of an intercultural encounter? And is it only possible to reveal that intercultural encounter when an artist trained in Thai classical dance performs Nijinsky's solo? So really interesting work. This is sort of an opening part of it, but that combines both passages that are referencing Nijinsky and also playing between that and the classical Thai tradition. So then I think Linje Kula's and Klunchen's reperformances of primitivist and Orientalist choreography from the early 20th century point towards a third impulse in the archival turn, and that is reanimating the impact of earlier works for contemporary audiences. I think in particular, how do the artists, recreate for a contemporary audience some of the power of those earlier works that have become, in a way, kind of cliches of dance history. And here, it seems to me, again, this is my viewing experience over the last 30 years, a lot of these works that I have located here really are recreating the gender and sexual dissidence of these earlier works. So here's Marie Chouinard, French-Canadian choreographer, her Prelude to an Afternoon of the Faun, recalling Nijinsky. You see her just powerful work where, she was blurring human and animal, blurring male and female in a way that I think really evoked some of what spectators would, some of that response to Nijinsky in the original. And then also Fabian Barba's Mary Wigman Evening did, I think, something similar with Wigman's work. He recreated her solos from the late 20s, and as I have argued, they very much challenged images of the female dancer in Germany during that decade. I think this is totally relevant to what Dor Hoyer was doing, of course, in the post-war years. So in one sense, he was reconstructing the solos from surviving film and photographs. In another sense, and fascinatingly, he was really recovering the precepts of his early training in Ecuador, where he grew up, where really this Ausdruckstanz tradition had, survived. And in another sense, his male body in these solos make those solos seem strange, presenting a dancer neither male nor female, or both male and female, and again, something that I believe was part of the power of Wigman's solos in their original context. So this is his version of Raumgestalt, and you see Wigman on the right there. And then another work that reanimates the impulse is what I just saw in Berlin, Esther Salomon's Monument 3, the Valeska Garrett Museum. This is a current republication of Garrett's memoir. Esther Solomon and another dancer were doubling one another. You see that they also are clearly doubling Valeska Garrett, also sort of taking us on a journey through Garrett's life from her renown in the 20s, through her exile in the 30s and 40s, and back to Germany in the post-war years, where she was really rediscovered by contemporary artists. And Solomon has performed this both on stage and also in the museum setting. That's where I saw it, in the museum. And this connects to the fourth impulse that I've discerned in this archival turn, and that's integrating critical commentary and dance practice in new formats, including the lecture format, digital formats, and exhibit formats. So this is Martin Nachbar's Urheben Aufheben, again, an important work, an important mentor or important teacher for Paul P. A work where Martin Nachbar worked with Dor Hoyer's air to learn the dance, and then did this fascinating work where he was both performing part of Hoyer's works, but talking about how hard it was for him, trained in the very cool style of postmodernism, to try to inhabit that expressive body, and just got, I think, anyway, won't talk about what influenced what, but this clearly, at least for the publics that saw it in Europe, was just a hugely important animating work that I think helped fuel this last 10 years of a lot of fascinating work. Here's a work that is integrating critical commentary and dance practice in a different way, Neda Yersulami's Paramodernities. This was a 6-part work. So sometimes she would perform 2 or 3 parts. I went to New York to see the marathon of all 6 parts. And what she did is she brought scholars literally into the rehearsal room, into the choreographic process, and then they were also part of the performance. So the first section you see on the left, dedicated to Nijinsky's Rite of Spring, section then dedicated to Graham's Night Journey, to Bob Fosse's Sweet Charity, to Cunningham's Rainforest, to Balanchine's Aegon, a fascinating section where we had a blind scholar really talk about disability in relationship to Aegon, fascinating. And then the closing section on Ailey's Revelations, and you see Tommy DeFrance, who so many of us know, who was part of that. Interestingly, there was a bibliography posted in the lobby and a lot of her books that she'd referenced, so again, kind of breaking down that museum-theater divide there. And then another work in this style is a digital work that Jochen Roller, a Berlin-based choreographer, did called The Source Code, where he traveled to Australia, where another Austrian dancer had immigrated, Gertrude Bodenwieser. You see her 1954 work, Aaron into the Maze, there. And so you can go online and see this fascinating work where he talks about the research process, reproduces some of the research documentation, and I think, like Nakbar, is kind of engaging in this, what is it to come to this very, in a way, hot expressivity from the cool training of the present. So there's an interesting kind of connection there. And then this points towards this fifth impulse that I see in reperformance, and that's innovating new formats for archiving dance, including self-archiving. Here's Boris Sharmatz's Musée de la Danse. This is a format that he's done from 2009 to the present. This is the 2015 version of the Tate Modern, where in an exhibit space, he himself, and he invites many dancers from other genres and traditions, and they both perform in that space, they teach in that space, they discuss their works in that space. A really fascinating format, a kind of living archive of dance, a living museum of dance. And another, Xavier Legal's retrospective. These are from the most recent iteration in Berlin, but a format that he's done from 2012. And this is more of a self-archiving format where there are a number of his own dances that get recreated, but then all the performers who are working with him sort of self-archive themselves because they all perform a text plus movement work that they've created in response to a moment in his work. So it's both a retrospective of Xavier, but a retrospective of the different performers who are part of this. And I just have to say, he's done about a dozen of these, really in a lot of places, in Mexico City, in Bogota, in Rio, in Salvador, in Beirut, in Singapore, in Taipei, as well as in New York and in Europe. And the last of my little examples, Ong Ken Chen, the curator from Singapore, who devised this term, the archival turn. He did a wonderful dance archive box project where he had artists in Asia put together materials from their work in a box, and then that was given to another artist to sort of reperform, reenact in their own way. Although he's no longer doing this, a Japanese dramaturg scholar named Nanako Najima is currently continuing this project in Berlin. So just in summary, and I hope this has not been too obnoxious, a little scholarly thing here, just the point of this was to show you that this is not just artists from the Europe and US and Canada, but from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and again, these are just some of the impulses that I see crossing this work in the last 30 years, though in the last decade, certainly this genre has become very prominent. Okay, now we can have real conversation, guys.
Wow. Well, thank you, Susan, for this amazing overview. More than an overview, in fact. That's certainly a good starting point for our discussions. But as things sometimes happen, I totally forgot to present before, handing over. I totally forgot to present the other panelists. I'm sorry about that. So I catch up on that mistake. So right to my left is Paul P., a Brazilian trance dance artist based in France. He's interested in a broader understanding of the choreographic field, working around questions about memory and temporality, language, and the notions of archive and translation in dance. He's a graduate in music from the University of Campinas in Brazil. And he also received a choreographic master in the Exerce program at the National Choreographic Center in Montpellier in France. Sorry, I did some handwriting, which I have trouble reading now. Before getting involved with contemporary dance, he worked in theater, music, and opera, and he has since collaborated with various artists, Clarissa Sakeli, Esther Salamon, Latifa Labisi, Aude Lachaise, Anna Anderegg, and others. In 2017, he founded the company No Drama in France and created since the solo works Me Too, Galatea in 2018, La, pardon, in 2019. And he's also a founding member of Transcendance or Transcendance, a workshop series by and for transgender, non-binary, and intersex and questioning people. Nejla is next. An award-winning and Nejla Yatkin, an award-winning and critically acclaimed choreographer and dancer, and a recent Drama Desk Award nominee. She's also Chita Rivera nominee for Outstanding Choreography, a 3 Arts awardee, and a Princess Grace Choreography Award Fellow. Nejla hails from Germany, bringing a luminous and transcultural perspective to her creations. Her focus is regularly drawn to the role that memory and history serve in constructing identity, which is one of the topics I think that interests us tonight, causing and resolving conflict, and the possibility of transforming cultural tensions into deep, authentic moments of human connection. And last, I mean in the row, is Ramon Rivera Cervera, professor and chair at Northwestern University's Department of Performance Studies. His research focuses on 20th and 21st century performance in North America and the Caribbean, with a special emphasis on the ways categories of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality are negotiated across national borders through migratory circuits of circulation and exchange. His work documents a wide array of performance practices ranging from theater and concert dance to social dance, popular music, fashion, and speech. He's author of Performing Queer Latinidad, Dance, Sexuality, Politics in 2012, a study of the role performance played in the development of Latina and Latino queer publics in the United States from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. So, as I said, distinguished experts in their field, but also, of course, in the field of you know, how to say, observing history in a different way, let's say, or historic connections, or the role history and historic effects can play in our contemporary viewing traditions. So maybe I can start, I can let's say, propose the microphone to you first, because we have seen your work, the presentation tonight, which has also been part of the program in Berlin, What the Body Does Remember. Do you feel comfortable as an artist in dance and choreography to be assigned to this question of history, sort of with a major H, you know, not history in general, but the big history? Is it actually what's the, let's say, your curiosity in historic dance work.
Hello. So I'm not at all an expert on archives, but I don't know. I think I ended up being interested by these things, and I was thinking about it before coming here. That I remember that the first time that this question really struck me was reading a book of this Brazilian artist that is called Hélio Iticica, which is a visual artist. And he was writing about the relationship to history in Brazil. And he says that in Brazil, history is, I don't know how to call this, the object that was used to erase when writing with ink. I don't know what the name of this. No, the object that when you would write with the pen, the ink, and then you would put this thing, which is this big object that erases the ink, that absorbs the ink. Yeah. So I don't know.
I'm
the
not
name
sure
of the
in
thing.
English, not myself.
So he would say that in Brazil, history is this object, meaning that everything is erased all the time. And nowadays is a moment with this is very concrete, what is happening politically now and how we erase everything and we pretend that nothing happened. So and this was, I don't know, 10 years ago. This really struck me. I still think about this question. But it's interesting that you asked me this thing about the big H, because this, I was in this event, so in Berlin, and I'm still trying to digest this event, because it was in many ways a very interesting and not easy moment to live, because I think I was very naive. I had this feeling of, wow, I'm getting into the history of these dances, which for me was very strange and funny, actually, because, I mean, being a Brazilian person that was not even trained in dance, it felt very, I don't know, important to be invited to such an event. And in Berlin, it was the only piece that was performed in 3 versions in the same evening. So there was my version of the Efectos Humanos, of how I dealt with this piece, and there was also the version of Niels Freyer and of Renata Graziadei, which is actually the version of Susanna Linke, but danced by Renata. So it was this thing about comparing and everything, and so I thought, like, wow, we're gonna be able to have a dialogue and a discussion of this. And then I realized that that was not really possible. At least that's how I felt it, because there was a talk after the performances, and it was kind of a shock because it was just a physical thing, that in the talk I felt that I was really not there. I was like physically excluded from the talk. And it was very interesting because there was Martin Nachbach that was also there, and then there was this thing of like, no, your version does not exist, like it doesn't count. And then, thinking about it, I have this big question concerning the word heritage, actually. And I was already thinking about it when I arrived in Berlin, and that evening and it's still very strong, and I'm trying to understand this. I think is my big question right now, is because when I think about this word that we also use when you talk about archives, so dance heritage, I started thinking about this word with a big H too, and I feel like I don't identify with this word, and I'm trying to think, should we still use this word or reappropriate, like was done with the word queer or other words? Because for me, heritage is about patrimony, is about property, is about privilege, is about powers. If I feel like, these are the first things that come into my mind when I think about this word. So I remember that day I went to bed thinking, like, I don't want to be part of, I don't want to be a heir, if this is what it means. I mean, I prefer to remain an outsider, actually, of this history, you know. So I was thinking about this panel, thinking more about sharing questions than answers. And the other moment that was also strong for me was during the talk by Deborah Hay. And I still have the sentence in my mind, which is, she says a lot, she talks a lot about here and gone, here and gone, here and gone, here and gone, which is a practice that she has, and I really admire. She also came to Exerce, to this master's program, and it was a very strong moment. But that day, when she was talking about it, I was thinking like, no, I don't agree. I was like, here and not gone. I mean, I'm thinking maybe about also this thing of erasure and like, what does this mean? And it makes me think also about this, what Rebecca Schneider wrote on performance remains, which is something that I have been thinking a lot, that is connected to oral history, and like when we say that the performance is ephemeral and dance, and more I try to think about really what stays, and what stays for me is encounters, is relationship, and that day, talking to Martin Nachbar later, I was talking to him and telling him an experience that I had, and I realized how important it was that was to perform these 5 during the process of doing the piece, which took a very long time, also because I started doing the master's program. What was really strong for me was to perform these dances that are the 5 affects. So there's vanity, desire, hate, fear, and love, to very different audiences of people that did not have any experience watching contemporary dance. And I realized very quickly that something happened. It was very strong, the connection of people, that many people came to me to talk to me, and they were really, they felt something with these dances, and that was very surprising, because I felt, wow, but these dances, they were made in '62, but they look like they were made in 1940s, but something happens, there's something happening, like today, through my body, something happens. And so I decided to continue doing this, even after I did this final version, Ecce Homo. I stopped doing it very recently. I think I should start doing it again, but every time I would perform, I would ask the venue to also, that I could, to allow me to encounter different kind of audiences, people that would not come to the theater, so I would perform these dances elsewhere. And then I would be affected by this encounter to dance on stage later. So it was also a wish, I think, to have more presences with me on each night. And one of the experiences that was really strong was performing in a female prison in France. And yeah, there was no need to know anything about dance history in order to be able to discuss about this. And because this is a big question for me when I watch other projects, is how can the audience relate to things if they don't know the history? I mean, I think I really enjoy watching pieces where there are many layers, and if you know the history, there's another layer, but that cannot be the only layer to the work. And then talking to Martin, he was like, you should have talked about this, and it also makes me think of one thing that I wanted to share that was really important in the very beginning when I arrived at Exerce and I was starting to learn the first dance, was something that André Lepecki, that is a Brazilian scholar based here in the States, says about, when he's talking about Martin Nachbar's work, actually, and he's talking about what is the, because I read it in Portuguese, sorry. But he's talking about how to undo the authority of the author, and then he's talking about what can be actualized, how do you say this? The possible actualizations, can you say this in English? Of a work that was not possible through its author, but that is maybe possible now. And this was very strong for me when I was working. And in all these encounters, I was really like, yes, there's something that is possible today. But now I'm also thinking about, yes, it's possible to actualize, I don't know how to say this, things through the work that even the author did not imagine. But I also feel that the work also, how do you say this in English? Actualizes things in myself that I could not imagine. So I think it goes both ways, you know. And this is something I hadn't thought about, and I started thinking about because of this panel, because I started rethinking about these things.
It's very interesting. And there's also part of the question because I felt there was an uneasiness in the entire program in Berlin, and your version, which was much more personal, if I can say, contrasting to the other ones who were very much into really redoing. And so the authorial position was much less clear, I think, in these works sorry, than in yours. And this brings, of course, I mean, this calls on the question of, you know, in dealing with archive, there's always the power question that's being discussed. The archive is an instrument of power. It excludes just as it includes, and so does history. You know, what is part of history and what is remembered in history. So the kind of work, and this is what I was, you know, if you have micro history, so your own history, which might be much more, let's say, worthwhile, important, urgent than the general history. In the case of dance, the true or faithful reproduction of the original. Anyway, in the task of the translator, Walter Benjamin says the task of the function of the original is not to be an original, but to be able to be translated. So the translation is more important than the original. And I think this is an interesting figure of thought in how to say, in being less, to be less intimidated by these questions that you have, that Berlin, I mean, the Berlin event was full. You know, all this kind of, you have the right, you don't have the right, this is good, this is not good, this is true, this is untrue. Painful.
I'm glad that you've raised the questions about the kind of anxieties about having to relate or not to that archive. And in some ways, one of the things that characterizes a lot of the artists that I've been working with, and of late I've been primarily focusing on a generation of artists since the 70s working between San Juan, Puerto Rico, and New York City. And the kinds of interesting things that mostly feminist, queer, and anti-colonial artists, for whom evading the archive was almost a mandatory strategy, because archives meant, from the 70s, probably since before the 70s, persecution. It was police persecution around sexuality. It was police persecution around gender comportment. It was police persecution, especially around anti-US American activities. So there are prolific histories in the Puerto Rican case around government archiving of careful monitoring of anti-American activities. It's called the carpetas, the carpets cases. And so public behavior and artistic behavior evaded surveillance and documentation purposefully, right? So then you're looking at a whole decades of activity that was highly political and confrontational, that wanted to happen, be bombastic, and then disappear. Really, it was work that desired not to be documented. So there are archives that are not in existence purposefully, right? And now a community, in retrospect, that also wants to recover those narratives, right? So an impulse towards archiving that is in retrospect, and that it's at a very different moment, longing for something that it lost, but also understanding that it never really wanted to be archived under that logic of that moment, right? So it's a really queer turn to what does it mean to enter documentation, right? So it's about looking at, and what's been amazing is that the most productive strategies for recalling and documenting the histories of dance experimentalism in this community have not come from academics, have not come from historians, but have come from dancers themselves who have been asking questions and incorporating research procedures into their own artistic inquiries. So somebody like Alejandra Martorell has been working now for over 6 years in experimental mapping projects with the dance community, calling communities and doing public interviews and narratives with large charting and drawings of the dance history of the community, and is now working on how to turn those into embodied maps that she can carry onto stage, right? So there are ways in which we can see a kind of anxiety around the archive be resolved through created means rather than formal historiographic methodologies. But really interestingly, around what is a history of avoiding archive thinking to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, our archive we like to think of archive as a state institution or something, you know, as a place of power, but it can also be a place of empowerment, of course, which often is, I like the image of this thing, who's in a, we don't have the word for it. Yeah. But you know, it's just to, you know, to wash out the traces. But of course, you need traces for your own positioning, for your own authority or whatever position. Nejla, how about your artistic, let's say, aims in relation to past events or to history, to maybe even archive documentation? Can you relate to?
Yeah, I have a long history of reconstructing dances with several companies I worked with. For example, here in the US, I came to the US to learn from the African American dance experience, because as a first generation Turkish immigrant in Germany, I was looking for something where I could see myself in it, and oftentimes dancing in Germany in my early years, I was put into roles of black dances. I was dancing black dances, and so I wanted to go to the root of it and learn directly from African American choreographers. So I came to the US to work with Cleo Parker Robinson Dance Company and Dayton Contemporary Dance Company. Both companies made it their mission to be living archives of African American choreographers' work. The year I came here, I jumped right into the production of Free to Dance, the documentary that talks about the history of African American dance. So I learned dances by Tally Beatty and Donald McHale and Catherine Dunham and Elio Pomare, and danced in works by Diane McIntyre, and ranging from the years of 1938 to 1980s. And then and it was very interesting, we learned from the video recordings, but then the choreographers were still living, like Catherine Dunham was still alive. She came in and told us the stories that were important to her to give us the sensibility of the piece at that time. And working with Donald McHale also was very interesting, coming in. And so all that informed my work. And then in the early 2000s, when I went solo, and also during my tenure at the University of Maryland, College Park, where I was an assistant professor and associate professor for 8 years, I worked on directly with Elio Pomare, reconstructing works with him, and Donald McHale, and Chacon, Limon, the Chacon with Sarah Stackhouse. And then later with Barbara Gardner, who was who I had met at Cleo Parker Robinson Dance Company, who was a student of Mary Wigman in early 60s. She went through a Fulbright to Germany and studied with Mary Wigman, or the Mary Wigman School. And she created a piece called Terpsichore, the goddess of dance. That means the goddess of dance. And I worked on reconstructing that piece with her. And then in my own work, I also often sort of research works of past choreographers. Most recently, I did reconstructing Matahari. I went into reconstructing Matahari. There's no footage of Matahari dancing, but there's a lot of films and books and stories, and there's also interviews with her and press clips that I found. And so I've weaved my story with her story, she being a middle class Dutch woman emerging as an Indian princess with a Javanese name. I, as a Turkish woman, drawing from the Western style, so I came from that kind of like meeting, she meeting Orient and I'm meeting the West and weaving it within both stories. So you didn't know if it was Matahari or if it was me, sort of similar but more exotic than what I saw you doing yesterday. And that was in 2005, 6, 7 that I toured that piece. And most recently I went to Louis Fuller. I sort of reconstructed with a dress that I saw in 1989. I saw the piece done by Nana Scheinflug's moving Chicago dance company in Berlin. We had an exchange with the company, our youth company. And that dance always stayed with me somehow because it was so abstract and reminded me of natural phenomena, nature, moving. And this summer I did a piece outside in the parks, and I asked if I could borrow the costume by Nana Scheinflug, and then I did a reconstruction of Louis Fuller dancing with the wind outside in the park, and so kind of spiraling and connecting 3 generations of women into this one moment. And so, yeah, did that somehow?
Yeah, well, that's more than than I knew or even suspected. Or
I'm sort of a living archive. I'm embodying a lot
Yeah.
of different.
So, but how to say? What was the interest in this, let's say, reconstruction work or this work on historic material? Was it just to learn or to understand better, or was it more the social framing around the works?
It was to learn, to understand better, and to, like, I feel like when you embody a time and a movement, you understand things that you don't understand reading about it. For example, I created a piece about the Berlin Wall in 2009. For the 20th anniversary, and it was recently reconstructed in St. Louis, and it was shown to a bunch of students of German literature, and they said they could feel the history so much more seeing it dance than reading about it, and empathize with the time in history. And so I think, yeah, that's like, through experience, I'm an experiential learner, and I learn through embodying time, space, bodies, culture. Yeah.
It makes a link a bit, even indirectly, to yesterday's subject, embodied thought and the thinking body. Dance as, let's say, privileged side of understanding, of appropriating, and of, but at the same time also maybe it's a question of resisting the history with the big H, and to insist on the microhistories, on the unstable histories. I was thinking in what you said, and also from your biography, that a term that's coming up currently, créolité. So we keep thinking in in many humanities, and especially in history, in arts history, where it's all national. You know, we have German dance, we have U.S. dance, we have whatever dance. But is it not much? Would it not be? I think, wouldn't it not make more sense to speak about the forms, the aesthetics that migrate, that transcend borders, and that are not confined? Because this is where things happen, right?
I think, well, I think in some cases, créolité and more broadly syncretism does speak significantly to some of these. I mean, in the case of, if I return to the Puerto Rican archive, for example, you can see some cases in which, you know, if you think of Santeria, for example, as one example, an Afro-diasporic performance, more specifically, the transposition of, you know, the classic example is looking at the transposition of an African deity for a Catholic one. That's the act of substitutions as a way of allowing the continuation of ritual performance, for example. So the simple substitution allows for a continuation of practice under a guise, right? And in those instances, yes, it explains for a lot of the ways in which some practices, some secret archives or hidden scripts, which is another term that has been significantly used in academic circles, have continued to articulate cultural practice, right? It gets a little bit more complicated, I think, in context of cultural friction and tension in colonial situations, like, or continued colonial situations where there are where real prohibitions are in place, or where actual confrontations are deadly, or you know, where you're working at the limits of life and death when some of these risks are actually taken, especially you know, in the context of, you know, and one of the really interesting things that's, you know, I'm working and thinking now, a couple of months away from a summer, a very momentous summer in Puerto Rico, where a governor was deposed for street protests that were highly mobilized and choreographed through dance, actually, through popular dance, through reggaeton dance, through what was called combative doggy-style dancing in front of the San Juan Cathedral, right? By queer and feminist activists, right? And that became the kind of the worldwide headlines for articulating what was the summer of protest and revolution in Puerto Rico, right? But what was often forgotten in kind of that narrative of how that worked is that what was innovative about that revolution is that it was indeed queer and feminist, that it was indeed articulated through a particularly different choreography of protest, and that it did not just pop up, that it required extensive training that was actually attached to a longer history of embodied practice that attached to dance experimentalism, that attached to queer theory and activism at the university, which is a place that conjoins both feminist history and theory with dance experimental practice. Literally, gender studies and sexuality studies in Puerto Rico has a dance platform outside its main building, so that when students are thinking about materiality and the body, they're also practicing movement outdoors, right? And that has been happening now for a good decade. And out of that laboratory of training is, you could see the young activists that kind of advance the kinds of more choreographic strategies that happened this summer, right? And then out of all the headlines that we got about the kinds of activism that happened this summer, which focused primarily on the iconic figures of big hip hop and reggaeton artists like, you know, Calle 13 and Daddy Yankee and Bad Bunny and whoever else was being vocal, Ricky Martin. What they forgot to figure out is that the strategy that was most effective was primarily choreographic, that it was about designing how to get in and out of this tiny little island that is Old San Juan, where the seat of power is, connected by 2 tiny bridges to the rest of to the mainland that is Puerto Rico, that it required strategic thinking about how movement in and out of the city proper happened for massive amounts of people coming in and out to protest, to oust this governor, that it required figuring out how to do that with horses, with motorcycles, with jet skis, with boats, so that when the New York Times is talking about creative protest, it's really creative, really choreographing movement in and out of a colonial city that is but 20 blocks, connected by 2 little bridges and 2 lagoons and a big bay to a main island, right? And that was done by people that had really clear sense of how body practices and choreography work, and who had a politicized sense of how that was important to make movements happen through movement, right? And I think in that sense, that kind of long-term articulation of a well-rehearsed archival knowledge of how politics work through the body is what resulted in the kind of efficacious articulation of a politics that now really needs redoing, because it's not like that moment changed that much the political situation of Puerto Rico, but it was a really good practice. Now that's the moment we really need to archive and retain and re-perform, right? But that it really required holding in tension the popular and the experimental, right? And a lot of the artists that I'm working with in Puerto Ricans are probably hyper visible the world over as dancing figures, as popular dancing figures. Puerto Ricans are absented from the archive the world over as dancing figures in the historical avant-garde. But Puerto Ricans labored in that New York avant-garde as dancers significantly, because that New York avant-garde developed in a primarily Puerto Rican neighborhood. The Lower East Side was a Puerto Rican neighborhood. A lot of Puerto Ricans were dancing for a lot of the white avant-garde masters, and they have stories to tell. So it's this really interesting juxtaposition between the knowledge that was acquired from laboring Puerto Rican bodies that were minor figures of the dance avant-garde and became major figures of the Puerto Rican dance avant-garde, and then these popular iconic figures that Puerto Ricans have been always in the kind of popular dance music since the invention of hip hop, since the mambo craze, at every single major kind of popular Latin dance crave or hip hop dance crave, or now we're trapping and whatever it is that we're doing, right? What's happening in Puerto Rican experimentalism now is somebody like Nivia Pastrana Santiago, who was the Whitney Biennial this year, is grabbing Trisha Brown's archive, the experimental dance archive, and it's grabbing Tego Calderon's reggaeton archive, and is intermixing them, and is doing Spanish dances to a reggaeton beat. What is happening right now is you're seeing somebody like Porro Dil, a large trans performer, trained by the avant-garde as well, who is grabbing also US American avant-garde pieces and mixing them with trap music as well. So you're seeing the intermixing of those things. That's the syncretism that is happening right now. So it's a syncretism of the popular and as a way of reclaiming and redoing the avant-garde.
That's amazing. But it also, there's a notion of accumulation. You have to accumulate experience, you have to accumulate also knowledge maybe. And maybe even generations in order to come up with a situation where things can converge to a new paradigm or a new, let's say, reality. I remember, Susan, that we have been talking, or you have been also presenting some thoughts, also in this Berlin event on some of your, Mary Wiegmann's transcultural network, I think, so that even the European traditional historiographies come to an end in a way, or have come to an end in the sense that it's always based on one figure, one cultural, let's say, habitat and one national definition.
I think, and then I'm feeling like I want the audience to be able to get in. So do a really short answer to that, but yes, I think, and this is, from the perspective of somebody who writes these histories, that, there was from the 30s, say, through the 70s, 80s, the writing of modern dance history was very much based on the nation state, right? And, so then we kind of wrote this history of American modern dance, which sort of wrote out the German influence, and the nation state history also really was benefiting decolonizing histories, right? Then we've got the history of Argentinian modern dance, or the history of Cuban modern dance, or history of Israeli, or et cetera, et cetera. But I think now many of us, myself included, are trying to, find, and they're so evident, they're all right there, find all those transnational connections. And so I was looking in that case at Wigmann in Asia. But I feel like that's a way for, that was a different archive. That was kind of going back to the Wigmann archive and looking at sources that I had not been interested the first time I was in the archive, right? So that's what brings it into the archive. It was quite, right? Any archive has so much, and you were focused on one, it was going back to the same archive. Now it's moved, now it's all organized, and, first time I was in the Wigmann archive, I was just going through boxes. And when I have to now go and ask carefully for this and that item, I miss those days of being able to go through the boxes, but there we are. But yeah, it's going back into the archive and asking different questions. But can we open out?
Yes, of course. Ask a different question. They were asking questions to the archive, but maybe also asking questions to the panel by you, by the public.
I guess this question is for all four of you. For the future, how would you like archives to occur? Not occur, but how precise would you like them to be? How do you want your work preserved? How do you want, because I think about the creative freedom that happens when you don't have everything. You only have a photograph. And now, and in the future, I'm very concerned with the future. If things could be perfectly preserved, is that what you would want? And then also, in light of the cultural context, what are your thoughts on that? So I'm interested in the juxtaposition between the performers.
Who feels addressed?
I don't know if there is an authenticity to reconstruction, because the body is a living instrument and it's evolving, and also the creator who creates, it's evolving and creating. So having experience working with living legends in a way, I could feel through the different stages that they would change their own reconstructions, because the body that they have in front of them needs something else than the body 30 years needed or gave to the piece. And so there's a dialogue going on, and I think I would prefer that future generations who reconstruct works of mine use everything from the freedom to do their own interpretation, to using archival footage, to using newspaper clips, to having conversations with people who saw it live maybe, or who were there. So all of it, in a way, kind of adds to it, and it's always a reinterpretation instead of a reconstruction, in a way.
I love that, because I think ultimately I agree. The archive will always betray in the process of reconstruction and engagement with a live artist. And I've had great laughs and great frustrations working with an artist in a studio we're looking at a reconstruction that is done to faith in the average of the documentations, and who's frustrated and wants something new, and that new is about that desire of the encounter with the work now, and the work should be about that now. You know, so I think archives are good guides, but they're never the totality of what we're gonna do with a piece of work, with a piece of art, right? So I think, but then the researcher in me wants as high quality and well-preserved an archive as possible, right? But also wants to allow as much subjectivity for that archive to be as creative and the artist's own as possible. I love going through artists' archive, especially now. You know, we're in a new moment of self-documentation. There's a lot of work that depends on procedures of self-documentation, and what that means for particular artists and for their procedures is vastly different from artist to artist, and I really love the creativity of what constitutes documentation now, and what is becoming the new archives for each of these practitioners, right? And some of it is fairly stable media, some of it is highly unstable media. Not all of it is digital, and I'm happy for that too, right? And I think it's just a matter of letting it all live and figure out how to collect and preserve it later.
I also agree with everything that has been said, and what you said makes me think about actually traditional cultures and how some people think that they are fixed and they don't change. This is a big discussion that we have in Brazil, for example, with traditional dances and everything. And once you get close to these dances, it's obvious that they're transforming all the time. They're reinventing themselves all the time. And maybe, I was thinking that maybe because what we do is with the body, it necessarily needs to be reinvented because body changes, because we're affected by everything. So I totally think that no one would reenact the work, even your own work, the same way if you have to do it again. It's obvious that it shouldn't be this way. So I think that thinking about, I never thought about archiving my own things. I think I'm too young for that. But recently I had a discussion with the director of the archives in the Centre National de la Danse. And it was very interesting to see how the archives that they have, there are so many things missing, I would say, that, like, for example, we have nowadays this thing with the videos and everything is just on videos. And once you start working with videos, you see how, actually, at least for me, empty it is, because there is no true transmission, encounter. Even if you're watching the video with somebody else and thinking together, it's already better than trying to do it yourself. But what I know, for example, for me, that really helps me and inspires me and makes me want to do work is usually to read more about the thoughts and to have access to what the person was thinking, because that opens much more. And I know that this is not, at least in France, we don't have much archives like this, having really access to the thoughts and also, like, for example, the performers, the dancers. We have almost nothing, at least in France, about. So what about the memories of the dancers? What happens in the studios and what is this, the oral body-to-body transmission? How can we have access to that? Because I think this is something that I think is interesting to think about. How can we make this live? Otherwise, we just have the video, and the video actually is the archive of the person that filmed it, also maybe even more than of the work itself. So I think it's a very interesting question for us to keep on thinking about this.
I think it has to do. It's a very interesting point, but it has to do also with not so much. I mean, of course, also with the constitution of the archive, but it's also the authority. I mean, the conception of what's important about the dance work. It's usually the person of the choreographer, and it's the work. maybe the music. But very often dancers, I'm currently working on the archives of a dancer from the 1940s and 50s, and even she herself never gives the names of the dancers, just the first names. It's just, it's Laila and Raisa and so on, but we don't have a second name, so we can't even do any research on who might have been the members of her company. And that's something that can, that's sad, but at the same time, it's also very telling about let's say, the status or the conception, the dealing with the art form in a given period of time. So the archive is sometimes less to blame than the people who feed it.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a, if the nation state was one of our sort of unspoken givens in modern dance history for so many decades, the primacy of the choreographer was the other unspoken given. And the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, there's an exhibit there right now actually on the formation of that archive 75 years ago. And it's so interesting how it came out of kind of the modern dance tradition, it came out of the primacy of the choreographer, and that's just again a huge, unspoken or spoken bias in the organization of that archive for sure. I'm not saying that there aren't materials on dancers, but but it was so interesting just to go back and see how it had started and how that bias was just right there in the very organization of it.
I had a thought just that when I think about the word archive, it feels like something that's past, right? That's gone, and the remnants of something. And it occurs to me, especially in listening to Najla talk about doing the work with Nana's work, that the archive is actually an ongoing dialogue about the work. And it could be a dialogue between you and the choreographer, or you and a former dancer, or you and a manuscript, or a video, or your memory of seeing Nana perform. I have that same memory of seeing her perform that work. So to me, an archive is not something that's past or a relic. It feels like something that's very active and being and present and growing all the time. That's just something I was feeling
Thank you.
strongly
Yes.
about. Sorry. Anybody else
Definitely.
have to want to ask a question?
I'm wondering if anybody is doing anything currently about trying to see to it that archives are being presented or being created. Is anybody trying to run around and say to dancers, please do this, or help them do this, or whatever? Ramon is doing it in Janae. Okay.
I think we do it.
Thank you.
We do it. Like, I have almost 25 years worth of dance making. We do it. We have it. It accumulates. And then it becomes an issue of how to deal with it when you have all of that, and the meaning of it. Like, what does it mean to someone besides me?
Sorry.
A year ago, after the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, I started a project with 20 artists, to help them recover and restart practices in contemporary movement-based performance. And so here I come and I arrive and we're getting ready to just get going with proposals to get projects going. And all 20 artists, the first thing that was urgent for them was those damn archives, right? And so we spent the first 6 months, every single artist, because after what had happened, everybody was in retrospective mode. Everybody needed to take stock of what they had done. Everybody needed to look at their work up to that moment. And it was just, that disaster put everybody into that mode. and everybody just needed to sit with their work and account for what their life had been. So everybody needed to build their archive and look at their materials. So what I thought was initially was an incubation project had to spend its first 6 months looking backwards and figuring out how do we tend to these materials because before we can move on into proposing what was going to come next. And so archives then become, and especially at those moments, really important, like, you know, life-giving things before an artist can even think about moving forward. So that's an archive I've been building there.
And I can imagine that having an archive on my own, that you don't, like, it accumulates over a long period of time, and it doesn't feel necessary until something like that happens, and then it's such an important part of you that, you know, you want to hang on to it.
I had an interesting experience when I was working with Barbara Gardner on reconstructing Terpsichore. She sent me a lot of material and images she was working off of for the dance, and also 4 video tapes of her performance, and all of the 4 were different. And I called her up, I was like, so which one should I focus on, or does it matter? And she's like, choose the one you want to focus on and you are drawn to. I was high every performance because I needed to calm my nerves. She was not able to dance slow, and in order for her to dance lyrical and slow, she needed to smoke weed. And then I was like, so does that mean to be authentic, should I smoke as well to perform this piece? And she was like, no, I chose you because you already are lyrical and move slow. I was like, oh, darn. But this you can't find in the archives, like speaking to the source.
Well, and again, that's the oral history part, and Janae Kutcher is doing a lot of oral history with Chicago artists for the Chicago Dance History Project. So yes, we are building an archive. Yes, we are. But that brings me to just a point, and I am kind of noticing the time and noticing that we're nearly time to get to our reception in the next building. But you know, this is, again, as a historian, what fascinates me is, you know, what doesn't, you know, what as a historian, as an artist, I mean, different processes you have to bring back to the work. I mean, for example, all the Judson works, and now, you know, there's the big Museum of Modern Art show on Judson, et cetera, but what that leaves out is what all the artists from the time said is, you know, we went to Judson and we watched people carrying around mattresses, and then we went to somebody's loft and danced our heads, you know, our heads off all night, right? And so, like, you know, so that movement on stage was countered by another kind of movement practice, which for the spectators at the time was as integral, right, to that. So, I mean, that's kind of like a time when a lot of people are smoking weed, you know, right? And how is, you know, what does it mean to do work within the counterculture? And that was, you know, and there was certainly a lot of weed being smoked at the lofts afterwards, right? So, you know, that's always, you know, that's why, you know, the most faithful reconstruction, you know, what we can't ever reconstruct is what that historical moment felt like, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I think, thank you for that remark. That's also something I think that's currently enlarging the entire notion of archive, of historiographic work and archival work. You know, how to better understand the networks. Like Simon Forti, who was involved in an exhibition on pioneer women in performance art. She said, well, you know, everybody is talking about Yvonne Rainer and the Judson Church, but it was an entire lifestyle. She said we were in conversation, and so many people were involved in this process and in this life, in this kind of social habitat. And then some works emerged, and today we talk only about the works and not about the conversations that preceded it or that came after. So I think that's also something to to keep in mind in future research. Time is more or less over, unless some urgent questions or comments need. So thanks, first of all, to all of you for being here and for your insights, giving insights, sharing insights. Thanks to you for coming. Just to remind, in an hour's time, at 7:30 next door, in the theater, in the auditorium, there's the second performance, Movement on Movement, by Noé Soulier. And the program Between Gestures, of which we are part, is continuing until the weekend. I don't want to say anything, and well into the next week. Right. So there's flyers outside. So for those who don't have them yet, I'm not sure. I think most of the have. There are more flyers and for the entire program. And so thank you again. Thanks.